Good afternoon. I hope you had coffee. We have one session after this, the one with Mr. Khair and Samir Saran on Anupam Khair. And this is the penultimate session, which is very relevant to our times. It's countering violent extremism. I will just give you a little bit about what we'll discuss in this session, and I'll go on to introduce our extremely accomplished panel. So information communication technologies have democratized speech as much as they have abetted violent narratives. The battle for mind space and ideas is increasingly intensifying in the virtual world, with adverse spillovers into our political systems. Recent efforts, such as the Christchurch call, which Akhi will tell you a little bit about in case you don't know exactly what it is, demonstrate that countering violent extremism is a global agenda. This panel will ask how states, businesses, and communities should respond to this challenge. On the far right, we have Mariam Wardak. She's the founder of Her Afghanistan. Before staying in Afghanistan, she worked for 2 years in the United States. She then started working with the Ministry of Rural Development and also worked as a project advisor at the Ministry of Finance.
It's so incorrect. I've been in
Afghanistan.
This is yours. No, I've been in Afghanistan for the past 10 years. Before I started Her Afghanistan, I was at the Office of the National Security Council in Afghanistan for about 5 to 6 years. And before that, I worked in various other capacities in the government institution.
Including the Ministry of Foreign Affairs at the Strategic Communication Department. Okay. I got the pronunciation just right before this. Michele Coninsx. Is that right? Okay, I got it. She's the Executive Director, United Nations Counter-Terrorism Executive Directorate. I'm hoping this one is right. Michele is a Belgian lawyer. She started her career in the Public Prosecutor's Office in Dendermonde. From 1997 to 2001, she was an attorney in Brussels. From 2001 to 2017, she was associated with the European Judicial Coordinating Body, Eurojust. And in August 2017, she was appointed Executive Director of the United Nations Counter-Terrorism Executive Directorate. I got that completely right. And Ankhi Das is the head of public policy, Facebook India. She has 15 years of experience of handling public policy. 20 years, okay. Who would have thought? She doesn't look that old, does she? She leads Facebook's efforts on privacy, data security. She has an extremely challenging job, as you can imagine. She's always buzzing from one place to the other, handling something or the other. Prior to this, I'm just adding. Akhi was working at Microsoft before she was with Facebook. She was Director of Public Policy there, Legal and Corporate Affairs. And she was responsible for handling strategic public policy projects and regulatory affairs for the company, Microsoft. My name is Abhinandan Sekhri. I'm from Newslaundry. So let me start. I want to start with solutions rather than build up to solutions. So clearly, violent extremism has been around long enough and has impacted us in profound ways for many people to come up with solutions or ways to counter it. So starting with Akhi, I'd just first like to talk about what are the ways that have been developed, deployed, and what results are we seeing?
So there are, this is something which is upon us as an industry. And I do want to talk about two specific initiatives which the industry has taken in order to tackle this challenge. One is, of course, a private sector effort, the GIFCT Alliance, which is the global initiative for counterterrorism, which has participation from other member companies such as Google, YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, of course. And essentially, it has a four-pronged approach in terms of looking at what are the areas or the action lines which we have set for ourselves as industry. The primary amongst them is joint tech innovation, which essentially means that how do we work together to build better detection technology, use various tools such as AI so that terrorist content can be taken down. I can talk about Facebook ourselves, is that we have in 20, and we sort of have published this out in our transparency report and our community reporting when we have done, is that in 2018 we took down more than 12.4 million pieces of terrorist content, and in Q1 and Q2 of this year itself, we have taken, I think in Q1 of this year, we've taken in excess of 6.4 million pieces of terrorist content because of progressive improvement in our detection technology. 99% of the content which is associated with ISIS or Al-Qaeda gets taken down before anybody has seen it. So that is kind of giving you an example of the type of scale which is involved in terms of improvement on technology tools and sharing that amongst the wider spectrum of people, companies which are involved there. Knowledge sharing kind of is a very crucial aspect of that. Then we also think that as at the GIFCT forum, we sort of know that we need constant research, and therefore there is a commitment to funding more research to understand what is this area, how is this area evolving, what are the newer, because very often you find that once a group has been on an FTO list or on a DTO list, which gets actively designated by member states, and Facebook will then enforce against this, and we will make sure that they don't have a presence on our platform across our family of apps. You will find some other proxy, them taking some other persona, some other group, and therefore we work with experts in the area of counterterrorism to understand what are these newer forms of proxy actors who are coming out, or newer forms which they are taking in terms of spreading online extremism. The fourth element, I think, which is very important and which is being worked on, which hopefully will get announced in details in the UNGA meetings which are commencing from Monday, is a content incident protocol, which again helps in sharing information amongst the various companies so that appropriate enforcement can be taken as this incident happens. The second effort, which I think which is notable to mention over here, is the Christchurch call to action. It is fairly exhaustive in the sense that it has a 9-point agenda. There are five collective actions which participating member states as well as member companies have sort of embraced, and there are 5 individual action lines, and then there are 4 collaborative action areas which we have sort of pledged ourselves to, and this again is going to get detailed out quite a lot in terms of reporting back at the UNGA forum. And essentially the individual actions are the following in terms of the 5 areas. That as a platform you'll have terms of use, which we all do, where there are community standards which lays down what type of content is allowed or not allowed on the platform, which also because all of us are intermediaries, right? Like if you look at all of these platforms, which also kind of is pivoted on the principle of a notice and takedown system. And then that means that you'll have to provide user reporting channels, because our community is our best watchdog in terms of escalating content or reporting to us content which are violations. Of course, law enforcement also has special processes via which they report content to us. So those are the 2 important ways in which this kind of governance model works. It's also about investing constantly in AI tools and better detection technologies so that enforcement can happen. Specifically in the Christchurch incident, because there was misuse of live streaming technology, there is a commitment to make sure that there is enforcement is ramped up when an incident happens, and if it is live streaming is being used as a tool to propagate that. And then finally, because we were having a short discussion before this panel about the human rights aspects when you're doing a lot of this enforcement work, platforms are also sort of committed to releasing the transparency reports. Every 6 months we do it, where we lay out the detail of the enforcement action which has happened on the platform. In terms of the collaboration areas, I mean, they kind of map onto some of the stuff which I've already talked about in respect of GIFCT, and they basically focus on 4 areas. One is shared technology development. The second is development of joint crisis protocols, because when an incident is happening at scale, you really need to trigger it platform-wide across, sort of all the internet platforms. So it is important that the participating companies have like a common set of information based on which these crisis protocols can be triggered off. And then education, public education of our community standards and what kind of content we'll not allow on the platform. And there is a very interesting point in the Christchurch call to action, because it also includes content which deals with hate and bigotry.
right,
which is a different species than the classical terrorism definitions which you've seen, but it does recognize that that is harm causing, it is capable of real world violence, and therefore there is specific attention which is being devoted to hate and bigotry as well.
Okay, we'll come to that because that's a little more tricky area in a bit, but for the benefit of our audience, GIFCT, the full form is, for those...
Global Initiative for Counter-Terrorism.
Right. Yeah, Michele, what are the best practices that you have observed and that have worked in different parts of the world?
Well, first of all, it's extremely important to know what is the threat and the risk involved in the spread of violent extremism, and is it over? Is it something that is keeping us awake during night? And indeed, 3 weeks ago, Yusuf Ronkov and myself presented a report on ISIL Daesh to the Security Council. So, in spite of the defeat of ISIL in the conflict zone, military spoken, we see that they continue to massively make use, I call it abuse, misuse, of ICT technologies, social media, and the internet. So yes, we still have a problem. And what is the solution? There is a tech solution which has been brilliantly explained by my colleague of Facebook. As we're confronted with the weaponization of the internet, the weaponization of social media, used to conduct, to plan, to plot, to recruit, to incite, to have propaganda by terrorists. And this has been multiplied even by a new phenomenon, foreign terrorist fighter returning and relocating, transiting all over the globe, and again using internet and social media to inspire others to do exactly the same, to be intolerant, to go to the extreme, and to commit terrorist acts. So the tech solution is one of the solutions. Another solution is to not only go one way, and that's the government approach, but the whole of society approach. If you have a narrative for a global problem, there might not be a global solution. Every single case, every single local misuse or national or regional or international abuse needs a tailored approach, needs to be looked at its merit. What is the problem we are looking at, and who can have the best message? Who is the best messenger? Is it the government? Not per se. Is it somebody from the civil society, from the NGOs, from educational institutes, from the religious leaders? Every single case has to be looked at its merit. So the technological solution is one, the whole of society solution and counter-narratives is the other, but I would say dialogue between all the players of society and the government and the civil society and the religious leaders and the NGOs. And with the tech industry, with the private industry, and that's exactly what we have been doing since 2015, since in fact the initiation of the Global Internet Forum to Counter-Terrorism, reuniting all the big players and making the bridge between the tech companies and the law enforcement, justice authorities, the government authorities, and also to think about what has to be removed in total accord with human rights and the freedom, fundamental freedoms we all have to enjoy. That speaks for itself. But what is then terrorist content? What is then material that's posted which is unacceptable and which leads to terrorist acts? And there again, I think that a methodology was found by the tech companies, is sort of a common approach based on the United Nations consolidated list of terrorist organizations, and looking at what are material posted and which is absolutely encouraging violent actions, which is endorsing terrorist organizations. So they have found a way to have a common approach, and that is spread among the different tech companies. Now, our initiative of CTAT, my organization, I'm leading the Counter-Terrorism Executive Directorate for the Security Council, is Attack Against Terrorism. And that's a public-private partnership which has been in total accord with the human rights, international humanitarian rights, bringing together the public and the private sector.
And you do this through dialogues at forums, at symposiums?
And indeed meant to support the tech companies, and also not only the tech companies.
No, when you say you bring them together on what kind of platform? Like you bring them together on a dialogue which is live streamed?
On a dialogue which is meant to have a better understanding what is violent extremist content, what is material that is unacceptable, and how can we moderate it, how can we take it off without making any other breaches unacceptable breaches. And all those who are members of the Tech Against Terrorism have to adhere to the pledge, the Tech Against Terrorism pledge, that when something is removed, it has to be done in total accord with human rights. And the human rights principles have been described by a lot of documents like the United Nations Guiding Principles, like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So there, again, we put the things in the right context, but ensure a dialogue, ensure that those who initially were not supposed to take any action, it was only the governmental authorities that had to take action, those who are offering a platform also being part of responsible caretakers and gatekeepers. But do it alongside a dialogue, because things change overnight.
Sure.
And as we have seen in March 2019, the Christchurch event showed very clearly that one video was being viewed, was being downloaded, was being disseminated to other platforms in a minimum of time, live streamed, and part of the whole game, the weaponization of social media. So we are constantly evolving to new phenomena. It's extremely important to keep on that dialogue, but not to fall into the trap to say, no, it's the responsibility of the government, it's the responsibility of the tech companies, but to have this ongoing dialogue. Next week, we will have a high-level debate where this dialogue will be continued at the highest level. That is what the United Nations is standing for.
All right. Ms. Wardak, you've seen a lot of conflict in Afghanistan for decades, like you were just telling me. There was a civil war, but it's never really stopped in some form or the other. It's been around. But the violence has kind of, the crests and the troughs. In your experience, what makes a trough happen? Is it some intervention that works?
Okay, so I'm going to provide the audience with a little bit of understanding of Afghanistan. I know you hear a lot about it in the news, but there's some. So 70% of the population of Afghanistan is below the age of 30. The New York Times has once reported that social media was introduced by a finance program by the United States called PayWesta. And according to multiple surveys, only 30% of today's population has access to internet. And according to the UN, 41% of Afghans have reliable source of electricity. So that gives you a better understanding of why not the whole population doesn't have access. Introduction to 3G was in 2012, and 87% of those users have only access to internet through their smartphones. All ages use social media. We have the elderly, and we also have the young. Social media has been an excellent platform for advocacy, especially for women. We've had great hashtags. For example, Her Afghanistan. It started out as a hashtag, and then it turned into an organization. We have Where Is My Name? It's an organization of a young girl who was so fed up that her name was not put on a wedding card, and then she started a whole hashtag, and all the other girls started this. So social media became a latest fashion trend. It also became a tool for safety. When there's a terrorist attack, we report it immediately on social media. But I do want to talk about something really interesting. The Taliban were strictly opposed to any modern technology. So no television, no camera, no radios, etc. But today, they benefit from social media. They record, they use drones to record their attacks, cameras, and they post it on social media. I think they have over 60 or 70,000 Twitter followers. They use Facebook, but through aliases, and mostly of pretty women's faces on those accounts for recruitment. Now, sharing all of that above with you, Afghanistan is still a country where word of mouth is really important. So 95% of the people that are using internet, 95% of those people had a Facebook account. So much of the content came from Facebook, and then they would discuss it, and then the rural community would hear from their families that had access to Facebook. So I express this to you because of the danger that it can possibly cause. And when I was working at the Office of the National Security Council, that was I was a part of the team that was developing the CVE strategy. I noticed that there were many flaws. One, we focused so much on countering narratives. You can't counter a narrative, no matter how quickly you go, because by the time the government responds to it, 24 or 48 hours have passed, and they have already, their mission has been completed. They planted their seeds. So the argument that I would always pose was, why are you not proactive? Why are not you using other channels to just create your own narrative so then it could divert their attention from the narratives that are created from the insurgencies or other terrorist groups? So one of the ideas that I was sharing with my colleagues here is the ideology that religious extremist groups are pushing for is they're against liberal views, right? And we use liberal content to try to counter them. How effective is that? Not effective at all. So one of the suggestions that I brought is that why are we not using a more religious appropriate individual, preferably a female. I mean, there's statistics, when you see somebody that is better looking on TV, you tend to focus on the content of that. A female who's religiously dressed appropriately and using the proper theological arguments of why what they're doing is wrong. Citing hadiths, citing verses. However, the government also being very male dominant did not really accept much of my recommendations. But these are the kind of ideas I thought that would be best effective. But the ideas that they would use is that they would respond within 48 hours using some sort of mullah, or then using some sort of really liberal groups trying to say, hey, you can be educated while you go to school for 8 years and then become a doctor. But those doctors don't make very much money in Afghanistan. It's not very fruitful for them. The context of Afghanistan is very difficult. I mean, there are families that are living in sandwich households. So sandwich households is they live with their grandparents, they live with their aunts and uncles, they live with their parents, they live with their kids. So they go home, and most of them live in a 2 or 1 bedroom apartment. So it's 15 to 25 people living together. So imagine how tense that environment is. And many of them are not employed. So you have a lot of aggression, you have a lot of tension. So you have an insurgent group that comes to you and say, hey, I'm going to offer you this much amount of money and I'm going to offer you heaven. Will you join? So when somebody is in that situation, you have to really understand why they're joining. It's not like they're joining because they are really tired of their 9-to-5, 100K a year job. No, it's because they're struggling. So I'm giving you this background and also providing my suggestions to you because this is something for you to have also food for thought. And when you're working on topics or you're making comments about this is the kind of discussion that you need to have, because when you have dialogues and you have discussions and you meet with such institutions such as the United Nations and you engage with people from Facebook or Twitter or other platforms, these are the things that need to be in the back of your head so you can bring these topics up, because if I don't tell you what's going on in the ground reality of Afghanistan, nothing is ever going to change.
All right, thanks, Mariam. I'll keep coming to just 2 quick questions I want to ask you, and you can take both together. One is that countering violent extremism, while traditionally one has seen it as something that's the government's role, the primary role is theirs, or the primary role is of a multilateral organization like the UN. Increasingly, one sees the world over, governments are leaning on tech companies. You handle this. That's not what a private limited company's mandate is. Fundamentally, that's not why companies are set up. So are we looking at a changing narrative and a changing role or mandate of what companies, or at least large companies, will look like in the next 10 or 20 years and what is expected of them, which historically the learning curve has not equipped us for. It's equipped government and international agencies for that. And secondly, while, like Michele was saying, a terrorist organization, something that's a terrorist organization that's acknowledged by all as a terrorist organization, whether it's ISIL or Al-Qaeda. Those are the easy ones. What about proxies, which have legitimacy of the state or state leaders? It's not so easy to negotiate those. So could you just discuss both those challenges?
Yeah, I think both questions are relevant questions. So I think this is the biggest challenge for platforms, which are built on the basis of user-generated, the UGC platforms, right? Like all the intermediaries, I would argue, like all the intermediaries which are there. And therefore, this framework which has been there in existence for a long time, but it's at least very active on the Internet Governance Forum platforms, and that is something I think which has worked well for multiple years. And I think as a policy concept, it's something which has now become an operational framework in this particular domain also. The concept of multi-stakeholder partnerships in order to tackle that. When you have a congregation of so many people using a platform, and again, I must say, like 95% of the platforms are used for legitimate good purposes, right? Like to connect with friends and family, information discovery, commerce, all of the stuff. There's this entire economic engine which you and I and everybody knows that, which is kind of serviced in a very big way by these platforms. But there's misuse also, and because of that, we have to engage and make sure that there are appropriate measures. Your point about what is the role of the state and state agencies insofar as they interact with platforms such as ourselves. Look, I think there are extant laws both in terms of domestic legislation as well as international legislation which clearly lay down the definitions of terrorism and terrorist activity and how they ought to be enforced. Platforms typically respond in two ways in terms of taking down content which are in violation of these sort of frameworks, global frameworks and domestic frameworks which exist. And the second aspect is the law enforcement response protocol. When an incident happens or is about to happen, and if law enforcement agencies become aware of this, and they reach back to the internet platforms in terms of data access, that is the other element which is at play over there. In those particular instances, then companies following valid legal orders and following due process will make a disclosure of that data to the enforcement agencies. And this is something which all internet platforms do, and it has now almost become customary for internet platforms to release transparency reports where you have a further breakdown and detail in terms of the number of inbound requests from which platform which would have got from a country, for example. I mean, since I also cover South Asia, I can talk about what happened, the Easter Sunday bombings which happened in Sri Lanka, right? Like, which took everybody by surprise because it was not sort of known like this would happen. And then, of course, we had to take down a lot of that content, and you see that when this round of report comes in, the transparency report comes in, or the Pulwama incident which happened in Kashmir, where there was a last will video of the suicide bomber. That particular video has been banked and taken down from our platforms because that often can serve as recruitment material. And anything which is valorizing violence or sort of can be used as a recruitment material will not stay on our platforms, it will be taken down. So in that particular context, there is a partnership model which exists now between this entire network, which is ex-counterterrorism, experts, civil society, as well as companies, when we sort of seeing this. What you talked about is slightly more edgy in terms of what is the role of platforms when it comes to organizations which are not terrorist organizations, but can cause real-world violence or real-world harm. And for that, we came up with this policy. And this has been, there have been events across the world, in many parts of the world, where you do see concerns with this kind of organizations. One is, of course, organizations that morph into terrorist organizations over a period of time, but there are other organizations also which are not, don't fall into that definition, but can cause real-world harm. And for that, we came up with a definition of what we describe as dangerous organizations. And these essentially would be groups which would have which would be engaged in practice of hate speech, which can cause societal violence or real-world harm. And then we would actively designate them and take them off our platforms. In Sri Lanka, for instance, we've done that. In Myanmar, it has been done, and it's been sort of reported. I'm sure people have read about it as well. But there are actions which we have taken. We are also learning. It's also evolving and iterative, because how do you predict how the platform is going to be used? Because again, it's all user-generated content, right? So we don't know how the evolution is going to look like. But we're trying to keep up and get inputs from various groups, experts, people who work in these areas. The UN system is just a remarkable area where we get that input. We also work with experts in this area. Mariam talked about very unique local conditions. For instance, in Afghanistan, we are working with a lot of groups, which of course the network which Mariam has built, but others who really understand local nuance, because there's of course a linguistic complexity, which is important to make sure that that is taken into account. But also you need, when you're a platform, you also need trusted flaggers who are sort of flagging problematic trends
and get the cultural context.
Yes, and based on which then you can take appropriate enforcement action, or at least analyze that in the context of, for example, the dangerous organization policy which we have. Like, how would we then apply it to a particular situation? For example, in Sri Lanka, we've applied that to the BBS Buddhabul Sena, which was engaging in a certain kind of speech which would lead to societal harm and violence and real-world violence and real-world cause of concern. So that is how I am seeing this field evolve.
Michele, the same question, but since the UN, like we were discussing just before this, it deals with governments that are signatories to your charter. But something that is not an out-and-out terrorist organization, but is endorsing, or it has dog whistles to violence, which is endorsed by the government or government leaders or political leaders who are in power. How does the UN, what does that dialogue look like? Because it will inevitably become confrontational, will it not? Or you'll just have to not comment on that, even though it may be violent and extremist.
Our aim is to fight terrorism and counter violent extremism in 193 countries. And my organization is having a task to do assessments and have dialogues with 193 countries, going from legislation to border control to counter-narrative to see how they are dealing with the financing of terrorism. And we see that in that dialogue there is one keyword that is popping up at each time, and that's partnerships. Public-private partnerships, not only in the counter-narrative, but we also see it, for instance, in the protection of soft targets. Look at Christchurch, look at Colombo, look at recent terrorist attacks. They are targeting soft targets where we cannot prevent, mitigate, and create resilient cities without public-private partnerships at all levels, national, regional, and international level, without strategies and action plans. Financing of terrorism is another example where we see that in earlier days we could just focus on the government organizations, but now we have to look at the private sector, at the tech companies to follow virtual money streams. So it is becoming part of our DNA. When we have a dialogue with the government, we tackle the national counterterrorism and counter-violent extremism strategies, and we see in what extent they have those partnerships. Now, in that same dialogue, we of course listen to all the partners, and we insist that every occasion that the human rights are being respected, that the freedom of speech and all the fundamental freedoms are being respected, that there is a gender-sensitive approach, that there is an age-sensitive approach. So it's much more than looking at human rights and fundamental freedoms, because the situation becomes that complex. And if we identify that there is a breach or a misuse from any of those actors in the partnerships, we will go back with a report which will be discussed in the Security Council, and we will then work on the outcome of that report, have ongoing dialogues with the member states and ensure that the problem has been flagged. What we can say is that we can not accept any form of terrorism. Terrorism can never be justified in whatever form or manifestation, and it should never be linked to a religion, a nation, or a civilization. It's just unacceptable regardless of the motivation. And that's what we clearly say in the dialogue with all the states. Again, our task is to have a CT chain which is as strong as possible, and if we identify weaknesses, abuses, we will go back and at least inform the Security Council.
So, but I notice you use the word terrorism each time, whereas I want to use the word violence, violent extremism, which may not necessarily qualify as terrorism. All the examples you've given are of organized organizations like the ISIS or Al-Qaeda that you mentioned. But we've noticed in the last year, and I've got this from American television networks, I think since 9/11, there have been over 10 times more killings in the US that emanate from right-wing, Christian right-wing views and extremism, as opposed to Islamic violence, such as ISIL. Now that does not have any stamp of terrorism like the other bodies do. And when you keep using the word terrorism, I find, and many of these organizations have the endorsement of the president. The kind of tweets he does, the kind of things he says in speeches. So I'm just trying to understand, see, Al-Qaeda and ISIL are the easy ones. What about these? How do you counter this? Because this dialogue is a more tricky dialogue. It's not a black and white dialogue. And especially if the person you're talking to doesn't see them as problematic, how do you,
It's a very right remark and observation, and it's included in our dialogues, violent extremism that leads to radicalization, and radicalization that might lead very, very fast to acts of terrorism. And so we had debates in the CTC in closed sessions on new trends, new movements. What we have to see in Security Council is it a threat to international peace and security? Is it something that is contained in a national context? How is it being tackled by the state? And not jump into conclusions. We cannot base our policy decision on assumptions. I say no. We think that women at no time can be violent extremists, can be terrorists. That would be an assumption. So what we have been doing, it's one of the policy decisions when facing foreign terrorist fighters, is to work on the risk assessment tools and to verify what are the threats, what are the indicators, factors, drivers conducive to radicalization, and how can we, by collecting disaggregated data, very correct and complete data all over the world in close cooperation with research centers, have a clear view on the risks and address those risks. Nothing is so harmful than to base your policy decision on assumptions. And to say, for instance, violent extremism, right extremism is only monitored online. It's only seen in one continent. There is no international link. So hence we have started to have the discussions in the Counter-Terrorism Committee and the Security Council and are working on it. Again, the worst thing we could do is to have Security Council resolutions, policy decisions which have to be implemented in the 193 member states and which are simply based on, I think that this is a new trend. This is not good enough. So yes, our findings are coupled to research work, and once we have absolutely certainty that there is a new trend, that there is a new good practice, we will disseminate it to the rest of the world. So it is much more complex than just saying, that is happening, why is it not being addressed, and why are we focusing only on ISIL, Daesh, Al-Qaeda, and Taliban? It's more nuanced as this, because we see that there is solidarity between terrorist groups and armed groups and criminal groups, and hence we had launched recently a new Security Council resolution on that nexus between organized crime and terrorism. Because if we only focus on terrorism and violent extremism, we will not move very far. So yes, a lot is going on. We are testing out, we are verifying, monitoring the implementation of all those Security Council resolutions, but also coming back with good practices. What is having an impact? How good are the partnerships? How good are we moving in the right direction, and what has to be done? Again, next week, high-level debate with all players to really verify what is the current threat, how do we identify the risk, and what can we do better together?
Right. Mariam, we were discussing you have a lot of faith in appealing to individuals and their sense of responsibility, which, of course, is a given, and that is the primary carrier of messaging and also the recipient of that. But other than lean on large organizations, how do you propose one at a large scale deal with individuals to tackle the problem? And do you think there's a hierarchy of who one should lean on more to solve the problem? While I understand there are multi-stakeholders, there's tech companies, there's international organizations, there are states and governments, and there are individuals and smaller organizations. But surely you believe there is a hierarchy in power and responsibility?
There's an invisible hierarchy, I believe so. I mean, in my world, if the world was perfect, I would hold Facebook responsible. No offense here. I would hold Facebook responsible in the sense that they should just completely, delete accounts that perpetuate any type of content. See, in Afghanistan, the Afghan government cannot counter opposition, insurgents, and other threats. They're stretched out too thin, and they also don't have that much, they don't have the capacity. You have to understand that this country is now 14 years old. It's just 14 years old in the sense of building technical capacity. And rather than focusing on that, I don't understand that why we are not focused more as in groups such as Facebook, United Nations, and the Afghan government to educate the public on misinformation, on fake news, and to empower them to confront misleading narratives. You see, I feel like the United Nations can put pressure on, again, we're talking in the Mariam ideal world, that the United Nations could put pressure on the Afghan government that you're stretched out too thin. Empowering and educating your citizens is only going to help you in the long run. And then having Facebook provide platforms, provide experts, provide translations, provide that tool for all the citizens to have access to it. I think that when you empower citizens, and they empower in the sense where they can question material and they can question information, because right now the citizens are too afraid to question. They're afraid because they don't look at Facebook as a private entity. They don't really understand that Facebook's actually a private business. They think, or they think that United Nations is actually a foreign mission you're looking at an uneducated society. So when somebody's coming from a rural province and coming to Kabul, and mind you, I have to inform you that the telecommunication companies in Afghanistan, they don't provide an internet package. What they provide is unlimited WhatsApp, unlimited Facebook use. So many of these citizens go on Facebook and they use Facebook as a Google tool. So when they search certain things, they're not realizing that these are opinions that they're reading, but they think that this is actual content. So this is very dangerous. And who else can I hold accountable? I think that Facebook, of course, has worked, not only Facebook, Twitter, and other social media websites, they have worked to empower voices, but I feel that as a citizen, as a responsible citizen, then I've seen how detrimental certain situations have turned out for an individual. We're talking about life at stake. So earlier I was speaking to my colleagues. Tomorrow, if you guys are walking down the street and you know that a certain content can actually kill an individual walking down the street that you walk on, I'm sure you will report it. You have to enforce these responsibilities. And if you don't, it will just continue.
You mean to individuals?
Individuals, yeah. And I feel like individuals will then turn into a society, and the society is the most strongest institution that there possibly can be to bring about change.
Right. We have very little time. Aki, would you like to respond before I open it up to the floor?
No, I think those are fair observations. We, and you know this, Mariam, we sort of made sure that the service was available in Dari and Pashto as well. The
yes,
language,
of course, the new
linguistic capability is also extremely important. So we did work on that. I think, going into the Afghan election, there is the PSA campaign, the public service announcement campaign, in terms of just offering the tip sheet in terms of how to spot fake news. And of course, there's whole amount of work which we are doing with trusted flaggers to flag fake news to Facebook, so that can go into then a review process. Like, you know, we have this process of actively demoting fake news. So what happens is then the distribution is highly limited. Like, you will not see that in your news feed once that gets reported, which is why the partnership with the local community groups is very important. Groups like Technician, etc., have been extremely helpful, not only in terms of flagging that type of content, but also the gender question, which you and I have talked about as well, is an important area where we have started some work and we need to do much more. But I think the language localization stuff which we have done, which is crucial, as well as sort of growing the network of the trusted flaggers, the community aspect which you talked about, will be useful for us to also learn more in terms of refining our enforcement.
No, and I thank you, and I don't want to think that I was trying to jump on you. Again, we were speaking in a Mariam ideal world, and I think that your engagement with I've noticed an increased engagement from Facebook with Afghanistan, and I wish that it was there from the beginning. But you have taken measures, and I want to appreciate it. But I feel like when we're talking about the risk of human life, I feel like I have to continue to stress it.
Right. Thank you so much. We'll wind up this session.